I want to welcome our presenter, Passion Star. And one of the things that has become incredibly clear to me in my years of doing work, both to respond to and prevent sexual violence, is that people who are incarcerated have unique needs, and that there is no way that we can come up with relevant, meaningful, effective ways to prevent sexual violence among incarcerated people if we don't understand prison culture and how that works. And so I'm so excited to have Passion with us today. Passion's pronouns are they, them, and Passion is the PREA coordinator at the Texas Alliance Against Sexual Assault. Did I get that right? It's TAASA. I always call it
Association, TAASA,
Association, the
Texas
Texas
Association Against Sexual
Association
Assault.
Against Sexual Assault. I always call it TAASA, but I figured I needed to break it down for everyone. So Passion's the PREA coordinator at TAASA and has a wealth of information. And so at this point, I will turn it over to Passion to share with us.
Hello, everybody. Today, this presentation that I put together is actually called Proactive PREA Understanding Grooming. The presentation is pretty straightforward, and in its title is basically about what we can do as advocates to address sexual violence in prisons before it has the chance to actually happen, by exploring different ways to pinpoint whether or not a person is actually being targeted for sexual violence while confined in prison or in custody. Um, so, as Christy said earlier, my name is Passion. I'm the PREA coordinator for the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault. I spent about maybe 2.5, 3 years in youth prisons, and then went to adult prison for 15 years. So, living out here in the world is new to me. It's wonderful, but everything that I learned about PREA is something that I actually learned from being confined before PREA even existed or any types of mechanisms existed. So what we're going to do today is go ahead and start. Okay, understanding grooming. Today we'll talk about prison culture and the process of grooming and what it is. We have to pinpoint instances of grooming and react to it appropriately. We'll also talk about different tactics to advocate more effectively when faced with responding to incarcerated people who have contacted us with issues that don't fall necessarily under the purview of PREA, and hopefully keep them from becoming future survivors. With that in mind, I hope to shed light on an often overlooked reality in prison, and that is grooming. And we're going to talk about prison culture and understanding grooming, Prison Rape Elimination Act, which is PREA, and concrete steps to take actions in order to prevent sexual violence and also change the culture in prison itself. First, we got to understand that prison has its own social structure. It's a different place. It's a place where you really don't know until you know. You won't know what it's like until you've been there. And it's appropriate about the culture. It's a place where everybody's basically forced to live stacked on top of each other. And there's a social structure that's built upon hypermasculinity and violence. And it's pervasive. And in order for us to understand and work better with incarcerated survivors, we have to get out of the mindset of being out here in society. There's a different society inside of prison. And what I also want to stress and emphasize is that news travels extremely fast in prison. A lot of times as advocates, we kind of, or I don't, but, what I've witnessed in the field is that sometimes that's understated. It's really underestimated how fast news really travels and how small of a place in the world prison really is. It's a world inside of a world. That's something that I need you all to understand. Okay. Now, when we talk about sexual violence in prisons, and let's say we're talking about motivations, And what the motivation for violence in prison, to be honest with you, is fear, control, and money. And understanding that motivation behind violence in prison is based upon the collective understanding that prison is an inherently unsafe place. So given that fact, fear is the most common underlying motivation for those acts. Perpetrators use group intimidation tactics, and they're moving, perpetrators are moving from a place of exacerbating the fear of individuals targeted for sexual or financial exploitation. And we oftentimes don't understand as advocates and people that work in these fields actually how deep-seated and profound the effects of fear as motivation is to commit these acts. If you were to look at violence prevention for the Center for Disease Control, the risk factors for perpetration. So if you look at the risk factors for perpetration, you know, you have individual risk factors, relationship factors, and community factors. One of the risk factors is like general aggressiveness and acceptance of violence. One, it's there in prison. Hostility towards women. Two, it's there in prison. You know, a lot of people, a lot of guys who are in prison, you know, they have deep-seated resentments against the females or the, you know, the mothers in their lives that were maybe absent. And so there's a whole lot of deep-seated things going on. And now you have so many people just packed in one place. It's like a constant cycle of people eating each other, you know, and it is really sad. It's really sad to watch. It's really sad to experience. Another one of the risk factors that's there, you know, emotionally unsupportive environment. We're taught in prison that to be expressive of our feelings and our thoughts is a negative thing. You know, it's taboo. There's things that, you know, we're not able to talk about because we're men or we're strong or we're this or we'll be seen or perceived as weak. So all of these different things, you look at prior victimization, you know, association with, you know, sexually aggressive, hypermasculine, delinquent peers. These are the things that are there and they're prevalent right there in prison and in the culture itself, as well as, and it's basically like compounded. So there's more than one person. It's just about everybody who's there, and a new person coming into prison doesn't understand these things. And a lot of times advocates don't understand what's actually going on. So what we'll do is talk about now is the social structure. Unseen, often subtle. You know, there's a social structure in prison based upon dominance and mental manipulation. If you really think about it, like, there's nothing to do. There's nothing to do. There's like a lot, like on lower custody levels, there's no job opportunities, no educational opportunities. There's just nothing to do. So a lot of times this is taken out on more on prison. Prisoners take these things out on each other. And it's about whose gauge is weak, whose gauge is hard, or whose gauge is strong. But it's all it's a mental manipulation. And, you know, one of the more popular tactics used by prisoners that I know, especially in the state of Texas, and I've actually experienced myself, is something called backdooring. And backdooring is actually I'll give you the best example of backdooring is a violent confrontation, and it's perpetuated by several people. And a lot of times it'll be several people from several different groups or factions. And it's almost like an initiation process, and it's designed to assess and instill fear into new prisoners. Normally, what'll take place is a new prisoner will come onto a facility and has never been in prison before. And this is something that's done to reinforce the fear already there and present in the other prisoners, and also to pinpoint who can be targeted for sexual violence or exploitation or extortion. And, you know, it's to gauge basically whether the new prisoner has a willingness to engage in violent confrontation or not. And in a nutshell, one person will initiate a confrontation with this new prisoner. And if this prisoner decides that they want to fight, then others will gather around them and create a sense of uncertainty and insecurity, because like nobody wants to be attacked by a mob of people. So the person who's fighting can't even, mentally, they can't even understand that this is a test. All they're knowing is that they're fighting for their life. And this will go on, like after the first fight, another fight will take place, and another, normally it's 3 to 5. And this happens pretty much on every facility that you'll go into. And after the fight is over, another prisoner will fight you, another prisoner, and I'm saying you as in, prisoners, but another person will fight you and another person will fight you. And it's a gauntlet with no real end in sight. And the purpose is to either break you or make you. And if you're broken, then you're targeted. If you're made, then you're not. So it's basically about what your response is, and the response dictates how you will live your life in prison. I spoke about this earlier, and there's psychological manipulation. Like I said, backdooring is a form of psychological manipulation. And psychological manipulation and tactics such as backdooring are meant to further instill fear in other incarcerated people, and done only in order to send a message that in order to survive, you must be hard or soft. And under the premise that the promotion of this toxic behavior is the only way that you'll survive in prison. Isolation is another thing that's a part of the whole grooming process. Isolation, predatory isolation. One example that I can give you of predatory isolation is, and I'm pretty sure that some, anybody who works in the field as advocates have witnessed it. I've witnessed it as well. I mean, I've seen it with my own eyes, having spent so much time incarcerated. But predatory group isolation is one of the ways to pinpoint who's being targeted, because it's the beginning of a grooming process. And you have to understand that prison is an extremely small place. Sometimes we may receive letters or calls from incarcerated people having a complaint that they may have came from school or work assignment back to their cell blocks, and only find that their cells have been ransacked and their personal properties, commissary, anything is just stolen. What I want to emphasize is that this is not possible to do in prison without there being any witnesses. There's no way possible. And the reason why is because, like I said, it's a small place. Everybody's stacked on top of each other. Even when dorms or pods or buildings are going to chow to dinner, lunch, whatever meals, there's still people that stick behind, because there's no, you have commissary. Some people don't go to eat, some people won't eat. And I know for a long time, like in prison, I didn't eat a lot of the stuff that they were serving. So, there's no way for there not to be any witnesses. Somebody witnessed it, somebody saw it. But the only reason that they're being quiet is because in the environment, this act here, it puts everybody on notice that this person is being targeted. This person is being targeted for either extortion, sexual violence, or just to control them because they are, they may fall in the marginalized community or LGBT, and they, there's a whole lot that's going on there. And this is something that this tactic here is basically done a lot of times really by gangs or members from several gangs. And that's the reason why people keep their mouths shut about it. And there are no witnesses, quote unquote, because it's a way they're instilling fear. This fear is also being steered. It's like, well, if this person is doing this, or this person has gotten this done to them, I don't want this done to me. So I'm going to keep my mouth shut, because these guys have power. They're in the gangs. They're intimidating everybody on the wings by doing what they're doing. And that's a further psychological manipulation tactic. So that isolation there in itself has the targeted individual like their back is against the wall. They have no friends. They have no anything. So what happens is they're either coerced into sex, they're either extorted. There's a whole lot that goes on there, and it's actually very sad. And this is something that like I said, I've witnessed this with my own eyes. I mean, I've gotten calls, letters, and this is something that this is a part of grooming. This is the first step of grooming. The first step of grooming. This is after the backdooring process or after the assessment process. This is when the first acts start taking place to control or dominate a person who's perceived as weak in prison. Now, what we're going to talk about is PREA right this second. PREA is the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And later on in the presentation, we're going to talk about ways that we can, use PREA as not a reactionary tool, but as a proactive tool to stop things like grooming from even really just getting as far as the sexual violence. That's what my main focus has been as the PREA coordinator at TAASA, is actually being more proactive than reactive, because being reactive to something means that there's already trauma that's been experienced on top of the trauma that the survivor has already experienced before they got to prison. So in order to try to stop that, I've started to use and learn how to use PREA in a more proactive way and as a shield to try to stop these acts from being perpetuated. So we're going to talk about PREA right now for a little bit. And PREA is the Prison Rape Elimination Act, and it was signed into law unanimously by both parties of Congress in 2003. And the goal of PREA was basically to eradicate prisoner rape in all facilities across this country. What I'd like for you all to think about, though, as I explain what PREA is to think about what prisons in our country were really like before the PREA standards were introduced into the correctional field. It was really a big step, and it's one that inevitably would change the face of prison, but it's also an acknowledgement that there's a very serious problem in our prisons, and that one that needs to really just be addressed on all fronts. Okay, now the Prison Rape Elimination Act was signed into law September 4th, 2003, and the goal of PREA was to eradicate sexual assaults in all correctional facilities across the United States. The law, it applies to any confinement facility of federal, state, or local government, whether administered by a government, private organization, or on behalf of a government. This includes local jails, police lockups, community confinement facilities, and juvenile facilities. The act called for the creation of a national commission to study the cause and consequences of sexual abuse and confinement and develop standards, which are the PREA standards, for correctional facilities nationwide. Now, moving from the logic that sexual abuse is not an inevitable part of incarceration, opening doors to a conversation that in years past had been offhandedly talked about in a joking manner. And I'm pretty sure that everybody's heard, at some point in their life, the dropping the soap jokes and all of that. That's not funny. It's not funny. But that's a part of our culture that is often overlooked. But it's a community health piece, because a lot of these people who are going into prison have trauma already. And then if they become a survivor while they're incarcerated, they're coming back out into society even more broken than when they left society. So basically, the commission defined clear standards that prison administrators must follow. And the reform started to happen in the underlying cultures, but we're not where we need to be. So basically, what I want you to know that, by PREA even being here now, it's acknowledged that in order to truly address the issue of prison rape, it starts with the leadership and the prison administrators addressing that there is an issue in our prison cultures, in the institution. And it's been like that for years. PREA is something that could really eliminate prison rape, but only if prison administrators and prison staff actually champion the change in prison culture. Now, the importance of PREA. Now, PREA was created, like I said, to eliminate incidents of sexual assault and harassment in prison and confinement facilities. It's also meant to be a guideline to protect all people who are confined from sexual abuse and sexual harassment. It establishes that there's a zero tolerance policy and standard against sexual abuse. And you know, is there with the understanding that rape is not a part of a punishment for a crime. And now, what I want to talk about is next I want to give you examples of different tools that we as advocates, if you do advocate, but I mean, if we as advocates actually can use in order to help incarcerated survivors or people who suspect that they may become survivors or people who know that they're being targeted. And some of the standards actually opened up the doors for a lot of us to be able to make these changes and help these people who are going through these things. And the first example that I want to talk about is inmate reporting. Now, inmate reporting is vital. It's CFR 115.51, inmate reporting. And what it says is that the agency shall provide multiple internal ways for inmates to privately report sexual abuse and sexual harassment, retaliation by other inmates or staff. Other inmates or staff. So that means that retaliation is not just from, it's being acknowledged that retaliation is not just from staff for reporting, it's from inmates as well. Staff neglect or violation of responsibilities that may have contributed to such incidents. The agency will also provide at least one way for inmates to report abuse or harassment to a public or private entity or office that is not part of the agency. Coalitions, rape crisis centers, you know, there are other like community-led advocacy groups that, you know, that do a lot of work. And it's wonderful that this is a standard that was actually created, because what it did is it gave survivors the ability to report, or prisoners who have witnessed this go on with one of their fellow prisoners, ability to report these things. So Part C in this, it says staff shall accept reports made verbally, in writing, anonymously, and from third parties, and shall promptly document any verbal reports. That is one of the greatest things, like I said, because, you know, now what that does is it allows for something to change in the culture of prison. It allows for the sense of community to start to be built, because now, where once you couldn't witness something take place with another prisoner and go and make a complaint about it, now you can make a complaint about it if you witness these things. Screening. CFR 115.41, screening for risk of victimization and abusiveness and obtaining information from residents. The purpose of this standard is to basically ensure that the facility has identified those at a heightened risk for being sexually victimized and those at a heightened risk for being sexually abusive, so that it can make housing and programming decisions, with the goal being to use this information to prevent sexual abuse. Now, the screening process, just like when, you know, the screening process amongst prisoners. Now, the screening process is often done by a Safe Prisons or a PREA officer that is on the unit, and it's normally done within 72 hours of being placed on a facility, and then there's another screening 6 months afterwards. But it's a two-way street. It's a two-way street. The screening is done. and it's done for aggression and, you know, people who may be at risk for sexual violence and people who may be at risk of committing sexual violence. But still, though, even though it's there, sometimes people do slip through the cracks. And that's why processes like grooming take place, because people do slip through the cracks. CFR 115.53 is inmate, detainee, and resident access to outside confidential support services. This standard says to provide inmates with access to emotional support services from outside the facility to help inmates heal from trauma. Access to outside support is important because the inmates may be reluctant to seek emotional support from within the facility. And that's the truth. I mean, when you're already been victimized, when you're already at your lowest, there's no way that, you know, like, survivors don't want to talk to prison officials about these things, because the culture in prison is exacerbated a lot of times by the officer's response or by the administrator's responses to sexual abuse. Like, one of the things in Texas that I know that has always been a thing, officers have, I've heard it, I've seen it with my own eyes, is that there'll be a complaint made like, hey, so-and-so has done this to me and I need help. And the officers will blow them off like, hey, you know what? Either fight or go find a man. And that right there is sad. You know, that's one of the saddest things that I've ever seen in my life. And so coming from that place right there, having the ability to have an outside support system or outside counseling or somebody just trained to have a trauma-informed response it does more to help survivors or people who feel like they're actually being targeted, because now there's somebody that they can talk to. There's somebody who has resources that are different than theirs, because when you're incarcerated, your resources are totally different. The resources that you have are limited, and they're only limited to what you are or what the administrators actually allow. So having somebody else in the outside support system does help give survivors strength. It does actually give them hope to see the light at the end of a tunnel. All right, now I'd like to talk about concrete steps for change. Concrete steps for change. Changing prison culture from within prison culture is really the only way that we as people can bolster the understanding that this is not acceptable. You know, PREA has sets the standard that there's zero tolerance. So with that being the case, as advocates and as people who work the field, I've been learning, and I've been, you know, I'm just seeing that building solidarity is one of the best ways to stop these things from taking place. And you build solidarity to promote the positive change inside of prisons, and it's really the only effective way to affect the most desired outcome in any of our advocacy efforts. And how we do that is peer educator groups. One of the things that we have to understand is that peer educator groups and building bonds with these groups is essential, because peer educators and prisoner-led study groups and prayer circles are a lot of times advocates already within prison and mentors. So their influence should never be underestimated. And one of the inroads at building these types of relationships, these working relationships as well, is to inquire about the different peer education groups that are on the facilities, because PREA does, I'm sorry, I apologize. Here we go. PREA does allow for, and I'll talk about that here in a second. PREA does allow for peer inmate education, and it's actually in one of the standards. So understanding that these people who are peer educators and lead these different groups, they're a lot of times the more upstanding prisoners, and as well as they're more upstanding as far as the group that they choose to, you know, unite themselves with or socialize with. And there's a network. Prison news and prison travels fast, and so there's a network. So a lot of times the peer educator groups know more about what's going on a facility than the warden. They know more than what's going on a facility than some gang leaders, because they have a plethora of people who are actually in their groups. The standard that I was actually talking about is 115.33, is inmate education. It says that agency shall provide inmate education for formats accessible to all inmates, including those who are limited English proficient, deaf, visually impaired, or otherwise disabled, as well as to inmates who have limited reading skills. The agency shall maintain documentation of inmate participation in these education sessions. In addition to providing such education, the agency shall ensure that key information is continuously and readily available or visible to inmates through posters, inmate handbooks, or other written formats. So with that being said, if we as advocates or, you know, coalition leaders, if we reach out to these peer educator groups, we have a means to building a relationship with these people in order to have witnesses to grooming processes and have witnesses to acts of sexual violence that prison administrators may not have wanted to acknowledge. Now, how can rape crisis centers foster relationships with peer educators? Like I just said, it's reaching out and finding out what these peer educator groups are and pinpointing who they are. One of the things that I've done, you know, when seeing that prison officials won't take a PREA complaint seriously, is one is to gather all information that I possibly can, such as grievances, old complaints, and being sure who to know who was actually spoken to. That's one of the things, like taking note of who was spoken to. And I've also found that major tool is actually independently reaching out and contacting any correlating witnesses to obtain their information as well as to what they saw took place. Because, you know, there is room for third-party reporting. There is room for third-party witnessing. There is room for other prisoners to make these complaints on behalf of their fellow prisoners. So, you know, it's just best. I also want to add that it's best to know that not only the PREA standards, but also how they're complied with in conjunction with the state's facility rules and written policies involving inmate safety. It's best to know those things, because when you know them, that makes any complaint, it makes any type of any advocacy effort that much stronger, because now you have these administrators, states, and facility rules right there in hand, documented black and white. You have so many different tools. You have the correlating witness statements. You have the initial survivor contact statements. You also have PREA, you have the standards of PREA, and you also have the prison administrators' facility rules as to how they respond to inmate safety policies. Now, when making a response or responding to a prison facility that does not want to respect a PREA complaint, any constitutional law discussion that you may decide to want to add is applicable. And by appealing to the prison administrator's sense of not only their jobs, but their duties as defined by their own posted rules and their duties as human beings, plus the independent witness statements and the written laws, it's possible to inspire prison administrators or other prison workers to look and understand that there's a broader scope of things, and, you know, and emphasize the importance of the issues that's really at hand. And that's having a understanding that prison rape is not tolerable. You know, it's not tolerable at all. It's not a part of the punishment for the crime. It's not. What I also want everybody to understand is that, you know, prison officials have a legal duty under the 8th Amendment of the Constitution to refrain from using excessive force and to protect prisoners from assault by other prisoners. So that means, okay, a fight that breaks out is just a fight that breaks out. But processes like grooming, coercive sexual abuse, those are things that can be prevented. Those are things that can be stopped. Those are things that can be stopped. So they actually have a legal duty. So now when you have all of these things piled up together, the correlating witness statements, the conversations about the constitutional right, the laws, the prison rules and violations, and the way that the prison actually responds to the complaints regarding prisoner safety, what you have now is you have not just a complaint from a single survivor, you have a complaint from a group of people, as well as the documentation for any supporting documents, as well as the rules and the policies of the facilities and the state's laws itself. So now with this, instead of making a regular complaint, now you have a tool to basically sit or email to or send to a warden or even a higher administrator. And, you know, things roll downhill, but now you have a packet. Now you have a packet of things. And this packet of things basically is almost lawsuit ready. It's almost lawsuit ready. And no prison administrators want to be the focus of any type of litigation. I went through a litigation with the Texas Department of Criminal Justice myself, and that's basically like how it happened with me. You know, there were different paperworks and all these different things. But when they're presented to a judge, that's basically all what it says is that there's something wrong with the system. That proves that there's something wrong with the system. When prison officials are not doing their jobs, it shows. So in order for us to be able to work more effectively as advocates, we have to bolster that change. And by bolstering that change is by contacting and communicating with the people that we are able to communicate to. And those are the influential people. Those are the people who are actually committing to change while they're inside of prison, and they have a very large group. One of the things that we don't a lot of times understand is how just a small effort on our parts does so much more to help somebody going through something as life-changing as surviving the process of being groomed to be sexually assaulted. Grooming is a process that sometimes it takes years for it to come to fruit. But when it does, it's very, very tragic because all of the signs were there before it actually took place. All of the signs were there. The isolation, the mental manipulation, the backdooring, the constant, offhand sexual harassment, as well as the prison administrators' blasé attitude about protecting prisoners from assault by other prisoners. And I'd like to thank all of you for listening. I will open up for questions now.
So if anyone has questions, you can definitely put them in the chat box. And I loved this, Passion. I thank you so much for sharing your insights. I know one of the things while we were preparing for this presentation and some of our conversations is in the outside world, a lot of times when we talk about violence prevention, we tend to silo response to sexual harm and prevention of sexual harm, like they're super segregated, even though we know they're not really. But in prison, you can't do that at all, because you and I talked about the fact that the way we respond to someone who is sexually harmed in prison sets the tone for whether or not it's going to be tolerated in a much more present way than it does. And I wonder if maybe you could share a little more about your thoughts on that.
So basically, can you repeat that? I'm actually looking at the chats, but I'm trying to see something real quick.
That's okay. I was just saying, thinking of this idea of because for some people who are wondering how responding to survivors has to do with prevention in prison, with the way you've described it being such a small culture, the way we respond is prevention because it sets the tone, right?
Yes, prevention does set the tone, and that's the thing. Not looking at PREA as a reactionary tool, but actually looking at it as a prevention tool. That's basically how it's best to be looked at, in that way and in that form. Because if you prevent sexual abuse from happening or sexual assault from happening, then what it does is it bolsters the sense of safety inside of prison. It was safety as far as bodily integrity. There's no such thing as a safe prison, for whatever reason. We all know this. Like I was saying, as far as the CDC, risk factors for perpetration. Change comes from within inside of prison, though. So making and seeing PREA as a preventative measure, what it does is it encapsulates all of the things that should be done in order to prevent these things from happening. That's what the standards are. There are different things there's different standards that talk about what to do when reacting to sexual abuse or sexual harassment. But a lot of the standards are preventative standards. They're measures to make sure that these things don't happen, such as the updates in the technology, cameras. These are things that, like, if somebody's property is stolen and their cells are ransacked, there's cameras everywhere. If the prison administration is not going back and reviewing these things, then that doesn't prevent anything. It gives the perpetrators the green light to go ahead and do whatever they're going to do.
And I like how you mentioned that, and you brought it up in our conversations too, that piece about making sure you're not just familiar with PREA, but how they handle other complaints, because those other complaints often lead to sexual harassment and abuse in ways that people on the outside might not understand,
Yes, that's the thing. And what I want to bring up to you and everybody is that a lot of times the way that the facilities respond to these things is to take a person and just lock them up in a wing where there's other people who are locked up in the wing for disciplinary issues or custody level changes and all of that. So understanding how these complaints are actually being responded to, or actually inmate safety complaints are being responded to, you find out a lot. You find out where during the deliberation or investigation phase of these inmate safety complaints, you find out where people are being housed and all of that. And you'll come to an understanding that a lot of times, and in most facilities that I've ever been on, whether you're in lockup for a safety issue or you're in trouble or anything, everybody who is on that facility, if they are in lockup for being in trouble or being a custody level change or safety issues, they're locked up in the same general area. And so what that means is that if the perpetrator is locked up for something and the survivor is locked up on the same building, now the perpetrator has the means to tell every single person in that building. And these people come from different buildings, and when when their time in that building is over with, they disperse to whatever buildings or size of the units that they're on. So now, if the perpetrator is moved off of the facility, the survivor stays on the facility, what takes place? Now there's room for further trauma and further victimization. Snitching is taboo in prison. So now it's like, okay, now not only are you weak, not only have you been, sexually abused, but now you're a snitch on top of that.
Yeah.
And what that does is it further traumatizes it further traumatizes survivors, and it puts their back against the wall so much that, you know, it's a painful process to watch and one to go through.
Now, I know in the chat, we had some people just commenting on what you said, that sometimes notes can be passed and that it's definitely an systematic internal day-to-day
Yes, notes are
operational
tight.
failure,
Yes.
overlooking. And I know someone a minute ago asked about COVID, but before I bring up the COVID question that was in the chat, earlier when you were talking about working with peer support groups, that was getting a lot of attention and curiosity in the chat box, that I think sometimes because of the way some of our movements have operated in the past, I don't think we mean to have a savior mentality, but you're like, I'm going to go in and provide services, or I'm going to go in and change the culture. And you forget there's already leaders in that culture. You can't come in as an outsider and do that. So share a little more about how do we connect or partner with those groups?
It's almost like trying to go into a lower, you know, a lower socioeconomic demographic. You know, you can't go in there as a social worker and say, well, okay, all you guys in this neighborhood, this, that, or the other. You can't do that. Prison is not built like that. Prison is not, that's not one of those places, because everybody's there for something. So now you have these groups, and inside of these groups, they have way more influence than what a lot of times you understand, you know, because if you think about it, most peer support groups or peer educator groups, the leaders are the lowest custody level that they can be on that facility. So they have a means to be able to travel all over the facility, and they're able to, and just like the notes get passed or the kites get passed, they have the ability to actually do a lot of the investigating for you as to what's going on and what's taking place with the survivor. They have that ability because their network they have a huge social network inside of prison, you know, and word of mouth travels fast, as well as their ability to be able to move around on the facility because of their low custody levels. So pinpointing who they are and who the most active ones are as to what's going on in prison, that's one of the things that's it's encouraged, and I encourage it. You know, like me having been in prison in the state of Texas for so long, and I've been on like 8 or 9 different facilities. So I'm known all over the system, so that when I became the PREA coordinator at TAASA, like I already had a network of people because I was advocating while I was in prison. You know, I was advocating for marginalized communities. I was advocating for myself. I was advocating for everybody that I could. And so I already had a social network. Like people already knew that, okay, well, Passion has this position. And now I can reach out and get the information that I need. But okay, well, you can get the information that you need, but now I also need information. You understand? And that's only with the thought process and the action to try my best to make prison a safer place. So I've learned how to use the peer educator groups as an investigative tool, because a lot of times, like being coming from the environment, you know, I was raised by the state pretty much, you know, from the time I was 14 until the time I was 33, I was pretty much in state confinement, whether juvenile or adult. So knowing this, I know about, you know, a lot of the different manipulation tactics and all of that. So now I'm able to use what I know, and like, let's say you coming from your background, get a call from a survivor. Now you only know how to handle it from your perspective position, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I know the lingo, you know, and actually not even just sharing the experience, but actually sympathizing with the survivor and their words, not your words or any words of the system, but their words. It does more to validate their experience, as well as does more for you to build the bridge to connect that gap of communication, you know.
So if someone wanted to reach out to those peer support groups, how would they go about finding the right people to reach out to?
Actually, the thing about it is that since PREA actually does does allow for inmate education, the PREA officials on the facilities have the peer educators have to be vetted and accepted and approved by the PREA officials on the facilities. So you can ask the PREA official on the facility who their peer educators are.
Cool. That's
and
awesome.
Then independently reach out to them.
That's awesome. So I know one other question in the chat that I saw was someone asking about whether or not COVID has impacted people's ability to get into prisons and do this work.
It really has. I mean, it's impacted everybody's ability to pretty much do anything, to be honest. But like, yes, it has impacted. Like, I'm currently on parole still. I can't even go into the prisons, you know, but then given the different states, some states are allowing. Texas is one of those states that's been a holdout as far as accepting MOUs about advocates going into the prisons without having specialized volunteer training, and a lot of that goes on with, we're not going to get into all of that right now, but yes, COVID has done a whole lot to basically kind of stop or slow down advocacy efforts, except via email, you know, via emails or calls and anything like that. So COVID has put a lot on it. But the good thing about, well, I'll say this, the thing to look at outside of that is that COVID has also restricted movement inside of prison. So group intimidation tactics and things like that have slowed down a bit, because guess what? People are being confined to their cells and not being allowed to be in the general living areas and spaces because of COVID. So that right there is done a lot to slow down. And so now a lot of times there's individual instances of sexual abuse or harassment by cellmate problems. You see where I'm coming from? But now that's just me being honest about that.
So one person asked in the chat, how can we get a peer support group started? Is that something that's usually organized from within, or that a center could maybe support the creation of?
Well, a center can actually support the creation of one. Basically, it's figuring out who the peer educators are on the facilities. And what happens then is just imploring and actually asking them, sending in information, literature, and having it passed out. You know, they can't, like, the prison officials can't deny that because it's PREA related. It's PREA related. So that's something that they can't deny. So in order to, you know, doing that, basically you're giving the peer educators a whole curriculum now to build the support groups. And now you're able to funnel in the information, because our resources out here are different than their resources in there. So we have access to way more information. We have access to different curriculums. We have access to these things that can easily be given to them. And all we have to do as advocates or centers is pretty much reach out to those peer educators and initiate that conversation. Initiate that conversation. Once that conversation is initiated, then, like I said earlier, peer education. Now, PREA, that means that the facilities have to facilitate the groups, because they have to what? The agency shall provide inmate education, as well as document participation in these education sessions. So now they have to facilitate these groups being built because they are PREA related. You understand?
I do. And we have one final question because we're coming up on time. And the last question is asking, is peer support group or peer educator sort of like a universal term, or is it a certification, or is it a Texas thing, or is it just you referring to the idea that people do these education groups in most prisons? Well,
they're called peer educator group. Well, in prison, it's called peer education. But I mean, looking at it from peer, you know, from an incarcerated standpoint, you know, when you're incarcerated, all these people are your peers. Age doesn't matter, gang affiliation, it doesn't matter, because we're all in the same boat. We're all in prison. So, you know, peer educator groups, but the peer educator groups that I'm talking about are ones that can be sanctioned, and that are in the standards allowed to be sanctioned and supposed to be sanctioned by the facilities. So this is a group that of peers amongst other prisoners who can now come together and actually converse about the change that needs to take place in prison to stop sexual abuse.
I mean, so Chris, there's a reason why I asked that question, particularly for the folks in North Carolina. And Passion, thank you for being able to be here. Passion and I served on a review of a document that Just Detention International. And then when I was in that space with them, I was like, my God, we need to figure out a way to bring him here in North Carolina. And so I'm glad that Chris hooked up with you, I think via LinkedIn or somewhere, to be able to bring you here, because you had great insight and information on that call. But for the folks in North Carolina, that's why I asked about terminology, because in North Carolina, what DPS has done is create this separate group of individuals that they call PREA support people. So if you're going to question, if you're going to go into a facility and ask them questions about these support groups and educators, you need to understand that in North Carolina, they set up these other people who are paid through DPS to provide some of the things that Passion is talking about, but it's not what he is actually getting.
No.
So I want y'all to be careful that when you're talking, they say, oh yeah, we already have that here. That's not the same thing.
So the thing that they are describing, that Passion was describing, is
just
not the same as this role that DPI may say we have. Passion is describing like in-house people who are incarcerated and providing support, which is a different role from what you're talking about.
Right. And so it goes back to what our conversation, right, Passion, that we talked about, what Richie was talking about. Instead of using terms, define what you are looking for. Because if you travel, because when you go into different states, they have different things set up around PREA. I'm not going to use the language circumvent, but it could be construed as that. So they have created these structures that they, as the law says, that when they reached out to community-based organizations like rape crisis centers, all they have to do is say to them, can you provide support? And if you say, no, I can't, then they created these other structures that really does not lend itself to what PREA is. PREA says outside confidential community-based organization. But if they reach out to Rape Crisis Center and you don't answer the call, they create these structures internally or use these other organizations that really does not do the work, as Passion has done a beautiful job within this presentation. So I would encourage y'all to connect with us, NCCASA, and we will help you to be able, I can tell you what prison it is, if you connect with us, and we can talk to you about what that reach out may look like.
Well, thank you, Robin. And Passion, I thank you so much for being here. We are at time. And so I am so grateful for this wisdom and this knowledge that you shared, and such an engaging presentation. We've been getting a lot of love in the chat. I want to encourage everyone to fill out our survey link that we have put in the chat a few times. I want to invite anyone who wants to join us for our social time tonight at Kumo Space from 4 to 5 p.m. this afternoon. And our final session will be starting at 2:15 in the virtual ballroom, which I pasted the link in the chat. And it's going to be called The Other Side of the Same Coin, a conversation about those who cause harm, getting us to think differently about the ways we talk about people who cause harm. So thank you so much. Everyone give us feedback on the session, and Passion, that was amazing. I really appreciate you.
All right, thank you all.
Thank you.